More than 15,000 economic sanctions are currently imposed by the United States on countries and organizations around the world, more than the combined total imposed by all other nations. Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, and Cuba are only a few of the entities on that list. Today, more than 1/4 of the global economy is affected by restrictions issued by Washington. What makes this remarkable is that the United States accounts for only about 25% of global GDP and just over 4% of the world's population. So how can one country exert such enormous pressure on the global economy, while even China, with an economy worth roughly $18 trillion, cannot do the same? The answer lies not in military strength or nuclear weapons, but in the global financial system. Nearly every international wire transfer, credit card payment, and oil transaction is connected to this network in one way or another. To understand this influence, consider three key figures. About 58% of global foreign exchange reserves held by central banks are denominated in US dollars. Nearly 88% of all foreign exchange transactions involve the dollar, and most oil and major commodities are priced in USD. These facts make the US dollar more than America's national currency. It serves as the foundation of international trade. The origins of this position date back to July 1944. As World War II was drawing to a close, representatives from 44 allied nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to establish a new international financial order. The conference created a system in which major currencies were pegged to the US dollar, while the dollar itself was convertible into gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This agreement laid the foundation for the dollar's global dominance over the following decades. Before the collapse of the gold standard, the United States held most of the world's gold reserves, placing it at the center of the global financial system. By 1971, however, the financial burden of the Vietnam War and growing budget deficits had caused the supply of US dollars in circulation to far exceed the country's gold reserves. As more nations demanded to exchange their dollars for gold, President Richard Nixon made a historic decision. He ended the dollar's convertibility into gold. From that point forward, the US dollar became a fiat currency, deriving its value from confidence in the US government rather than from gold backing. Many observers believed this would mark the beginning of the dollar's decline. Instead, the opposite happened. Only a few years later, the United States reached an agreement with Saudi Arabia under which oil would be traded exclusively in US dollars in exchange for American security guarantees. Other OPEC members eventually adopted the same arrangement, creating what became known as the petrodollar system. As a result, any country wishing to import oil needed to maintain substantial US dollar reserves. Over time, oil effectively replaced gold as the asset underpinning global demand for the American currency. This system gave rise to what many world leaders have called the United States' exorbitant privilege. Unlike most countries, which must export goods and services to earn foreign currency, the United States can finance much of its spending by issuing its own currency. More importantly, when global trade operates primarily in the currency of a single nation, every other country must also operate within that nation's financial system, legal framework, and sphere of influence. This has been one of the key sources of the US dollar's extraordinary power for decades. In international trade, a vast number of transactions are still conducted in US dollars. China sells goods to Brazil in dollars. India purchases oil from the Middle East using dollars. Even when neither party has any direct connection to the United States, the money itself is tied to the US currency. As a result, much of the world's cross-border payment activity passes through a financial gateway over which Washington exercises significant influence. So how does that gateway actually work? On the outskirts of Brussels, Belgium, sits the headquarters of SWIFT. SWIFT is not a bank, nor does it hold customer funds. Instead, it operates a secure financial messaging network connecting more than 11,000 financial institutions across over 200 countries and territories, processing millions of payment messages every day. When a bank in Vietnam transfers money to a bank in Germany, it does not physically send cash. Instead, it transmits a secure payment instruction through SWIFT. If a bank is disconnected from this network, It may continue to exist, but it becomes largely isolated from the global financial system. Yet SWIFT is not the most critical link in the chain. The real bottleneck is located in New York, where US dollar clearing systems such as CHIPS and Fedwire operate. Because the overwhelming majority of international transactions involve US dollars, even payments between two companies in Asia or the Middle East often must be cleared through a US correspondent bank before they can be completed. This means that trillions of dollars pass through the jurisdiction of the United States every single day. By controlling this crucial choke point, the United States can effectively prevent a country or organization from accessing the global financial system. Iran provides one of the clearest examples. In 2012, many Iranian banks were disconnected from SWIFT under pressure from the United States and Europe. The result was a sharp decline in oil exports, a rapid depreciation of Iran's currency, and soaring inflation that severely damaged the country's economy. In 2018, after the United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement and reinstated sanctions, Iran's economy came under even greater pressure. Despite possessing some of the world's largest oil and natural gas reserves and a population of more than 80 million, Iran was largely unable to export its oil, access the international payment system, or import many essential goods through official channels. Through financial measures alone, Washington imposed economic pressure comparable to a blockade without resorting to military force. Then, in February 2022, after Russia launched its military operation in Ukraine, several of the country's largest banks were removed from the international payment system. However, the measure that attracted even greater attention was the decision by the United States and its allies to freeze approximately $300 billion in the foreign exchange reserves of the Central Bank of Russia. Nearly half of Russia's national reserves, accumulated over many years, became inaccessible almost overnight through a single administrative decision. The consequences appeared almost immediately. The Russian ruble plunged, forcing the Central Bank of Russia to raise its benchmark interest rate to 20% in an effort to stabilize financial markets, while ordinary citizens rushed to ATMs to withdraw cash. The episode demonstrated the extraordinary power of modern financial tools without blockading ports or deploying military forces. Simply cutting off access to the global financial system was enough to inflict severe shocks on an entire national economy. The reach of this financial power extends far beyond the countries directly targeted by sanctions. In 2014, BNP Paribas, France's largest bank, was fined by the United States for processing transactions involving Sudan, Iran, and Cuba. Those transactions did not violate French or European law, but they were settled in US dollars. Once the payments passed through the US financial system, they fell under Washington's jurisdiction, exposing the bank to US sanctions. The penalty totaled $8.9 billion, nearly equal to the bank's entire annual profit. Despite direct objections from both the French government and the French president, the outcome remained unchanged. BNP Paribas ultimately accepted the fine, admitted wrongdoing, and terminated all business with countries subject to US sanctions. This illustrates the power of what is known as secondary sanctions. The principle is straightforward. The United States not only prohibits its own companies from doing business with sanctioned entities but also warns banks and corporations around the world that if they continue dealing with those entities, they risk losing access to the US dollar-based financial system. As a result, global businesses are effectively left with only two choices: maintain access to the US market and the dollar payment network, or continue doing business with sanctioned countries. In reality, very few companies are willing to sacrifice their access to the world's largest financial market in favor of the latter. In 2018, the Chinese telecommunications company ZTE was prohibited from purchasing American components after violating US sanctions against Iran. Within a short period, its manufacturing operations were brought to a near standstill. The company resumed normal operations only after paying a massive fine, replacing its senior management, and agreeing to extensive US compliance monitoring. Huawei suffered similarly after being denied access to advanced semiconductors and Google's Android operating system. Once the world's leading smartphone manufacturer, Huawei saw its international sales decline dramatically within just a few years. Notably, even America's closest allies have found it difficult to remain outside this system. After Washington withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement in 2018, several European governments announced their intention to continue trading with Tehran and established a separate payment mechanism known as INSTEX to reduce dependence on the US dollar. However, major corporations such as Total, Siemens, and Daimler voluntarily withdrew from Iran rather than risk losing access to the American market. In the end, INSTEX processed only a handful of transactions before becoming largely inactive. The agency responsible for enforcing many of these measures is the Office of Foreign Assets Control (OFAC), a division of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Despite having only a few hundred employees, OFAC is capable of exerting enough pressure to influence the decisions of corporations and financial institutions across the globe. With every new sanctions package, adding only a few names to OFAC's sanctions list can push a company on the other side of the world into crisis. A common joke in international finance captures this reality. Compliance officers may forget many things, but they must never overlook OFAC's sanctions list. By this point, it becomes clear that the issue is not a lack of political will among other countries. Rather, it is the overwhelming imbalance between costs and benefits. Complying with U.S. sanctions may mean losing access to one market, but resisting them could result in exclusion from much of the global financial system. If the United States possesses such extraordinary leverage, why haven't major economies such as China, Russia, or even the European Union built a competing financial system capable of pushing back against Washington? The answer is far more complex and far more fascinating than the question itself. Imagine you are the leader of a major global power determined to retaliate against U.S. financial sanctions. China would naturally be the leading candidate. With an economy worth roughly $18 trillion and the world's largest manufacturing base, Beijing also holds approximately $7,080 billion in U.S. Treasury securities assets, often described by the media as a potential financial bomb. Many people assume that if China were to dump all of its Treasury holdings, the U.S. debt market would be thrown into turmoil. That argument sounds convincing, but reality tells a different story. If Beijing were to sell its Treasury bonds on a massive scale, bond prices would indeed fall sharply. However, China itself is one of the largest holders of those securities. Every decline in bond prices would reduce the value of China's own reserves, potentially wiping out tens of billions of dollars in a relatively short period. The consequences would not end there. After selling its Treasury holdings, China would receive an enormous amount of US dollars that would eventually need to be converted into other currencies. That process would drive up the value of the Chinese yuan. A stronger yuan would make Chinese exports more expensive in international markets, weakening the country's export competitiveness and placing additional pressure on millions of domestic businesses and workers. In other words, this financial weapon resembles a double-barreled gun. One barrel points toward the United States, while the other is aimed squarely at China's own economy. For that reason, replacing the US dollar with the yuan over the long term depends on far more than political ambition. It also requires overcoming substantial economic obstacles that the numbers themselves clearly illustrate. Today, the Chinese yuan accounts for only about 2-3 of the total value of payments processed through the SWIFT network and roughly 2% of global foreign exchange reserves, while the US dollar still represents nearly 58%. The primary reason is not China's economic size but its capital control policies. Foreign capital can enter China's markets relatively easily, but moving money out remains subject to significant restrictions. For central banks and international investors, a currency becomes truly attractive only when it can be freely used, exchanged, and transferred at any time. That lack of convertibility and flexibility continues to prevent the yuan from becoming a genuine rival to the US dollar. Russia has also made significant efforts to reduce its dependence on the US dollar. After 2014, Moscow steadily cut its holdings of dollar-denominated assets while increasing its reserves of gold, euros, and Chinese yuan. It also developed a domestic payment system in the hope of withstanding Western sanctions. However, When the conflict escalated, nearly half of Russia's foreign exchange reserves were frozen within a very short period. This demonstrated that many other major currencies remain deeply connected to the Western-dominated financial system, redirecting. Oil exports to India and China also failed to deliver the advantages Russia had anticipated. Moscow was forced to sell its crude at substantial discounts because buyers understood that Russia had very few alternative markets. At one point, the country accumulated large amounts of Indian rupees in Indian banks but found it difficult to use them because the rupee is not fully convertible and Russia's demand for Indian imports was too limited. As a result, the funds remained in bank accounts without generating meaningful economic value. This illustrates a challenge many countries face when attempting to conduct trade outside the US dollar system. In terms of economic size and long-term potential, the European Union represents the dollar's strongest competitor. The EU's economy is roughly comparable in size to that of the United States, and the euro currently accounts for about 20% of global foreign exchange reserves, making it the world's second-largest reserve currency after the US dollar. If any currency is capable of challenging the dollar, it is the euro. Even so, the euro still lacks three essential ingredients, and each weakness represents a major obstacle. The first is the absence of a unified, deep capital market. When countries such as China or Saudi Arabia hold trillions of dollars in foreign reserves, they need an investment market that is both secure and highly liquid. The U.S. Treasury market satisfies those requirements with its enormous size and exceptional liquidity. Europe, by contrast, has no single common government bond market. Instead, investors must choose among German, French, Italian, and other sovereign bonds, each carrying different levels of risk. This fragmentation makes the European bond market less attractive than its American counterpart. The second factor is military power. At first glance, it may seem unrelated to currency, but the dollar's global position is closely tied to America's geopolitical influence and security commitments. A global reserve currency depends not only on economic strength but also on a nation capable of maintaining the international order that supports it. For decades, much of Europe has relied on the United States for its security. As a result, it is difficult for the euro to replace the currency of the very country providing that protection. The third weakness is decision-making efficiency. The United States can impose sanctions relatively quickly once the government reaches a decision. The European Union, on the other hand, must build consensus among 27 member states, each with different interests and political priorities. This often leads to slower responses and less consistent policies. Economists generally agree that a currency must possess four fundamental pillars to become a global reserve currency: a large economy, deep and open financial markets, a trusted legal system, and sufficient military power to safeguard the international order. China currently meets only some of these requirements. Russia has weakened significantly across most of them. The European Union has a large economy and credible institutions but still lacks a unified capital market and independent military strength. Today, the United States remains the only country that fully satisfies all four conditions. That is also why very few nations are capable of applying financial pressure against Washington. It is extraordinarily difficult to sanction the country that controls the world's dominant currency, the leading payment infrastructure, and many of the rules governing the global financial system. However, no position of dominance lasts forever. Even the foundation of the US dollar's power has begun to show signs of strain, and notably, Washington itself has contributed to those cracks. In the art of power, the most intimidating weapon is often the one that never has to be used. Once it is employed too frequently, rivals begin to understand how it works and start developing ways to defend themselves. That is precisely what is happening with the dollar's dominant role today. Consider the events of mid-2022. When approximately $300 billion of Russia's foreign exchange reserves were frozen. From Washington's perspective, this was an economic sanction. But for many central banks around the world, it carried a different message. Even a country's sovereign reserve assets may not be completely secure if they rely on the international financial system. Assets once considered untouchable could, in fact, be rendered inaccessible through a political decision. If it could happen to Russia, many other countries naturally began asking whether they could face the same situation in the future, from China and Brazil to Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. Many countries quietly began adjusting their strategies. Their first approach has been to develop alternative payment networks. China has expanded its cross-border interbank payment system CIPS, which facilitates international transactions in yuan and reduces reliance on SWIFT. Although membership and transaction volumes have grown rapidly, the system remains relatively small compared with the vast US dollar payment network. It is like a newly built road. While the global financial superhighway still belongs to the dollar, the second trend has been the expansion of bilateral trade settlements in local currencies. Russia and China now conduct most of their bilateral trade using rubles and yuan. India has also purchased oil using rupees or dirhams instead of US dollars. Meanwhile, the BRICS nations continue discussing the possibility of creating a common currency. Although turning that idea into reality remains a formidable challenge, perhaps the most striking development has been the surge in gold purchases by central banks. In recent years, annual gold purchases have frequently exceeded 1,000 metric tons, the highest levels seen in decades. The reason is straightforward. Gold is a physical asset held directly by the owning country. It does not depend on another nation's financial commitments or payment infrastructure and is therefore far less vulnerable to being frozen through international sanctions. At the same time, many countries have begun experimenting with central bank digital currencies (CBDCs). Several cross-border payment initiatives aim to enable central banks to settle transactions directly with one another, eliminating the need for correspondent banks in New York. If these systems prove successful, the ability to monitor, control, or block international transactions could be significantly reduced. Although the process of reducing dependence on the US dollar is underway, it cannot happen overnight. This is a long-term trend that will likely unfold over decades. In 2000, the US dollar accounted for about 71% of global foreign exchange reserves. Today, that figure has fallen to roughly 58%. A decline of just over 10 percentage points in nearly a quarter of a century illustrates how gradual this shift has been. The dollar has not lost its dominant position, but its influence is slowly diminishing rather than collapsing all at once. The most important part of the story, however, comes at the end. The greatest threat to the US dollar's dominance may not come from China or Russia, it may come from the United States itself. Washington's national debt has surpassed $36 trillion, and the annual interest payments now exceed the country's entire defense budget. In other words, the world's leading military power is spending more on servicing its debt than on maintaining its armed forces. At the same time, every time the US Congress clashes over raising the federal debt ceiling, the world watches as the nation's ability to meet its financial obligations becomes a political bargaining chip. Those repeated confrontations gradually erode the very qualities that help the dollar achieve global dominance: stability and confidence in the rule of law. History shows that financial empires rarely collapse because they are defeated by rivals. More often, they weaken from excessive spending, mounting debt, and the belief that their dominance will last forever. The Roman Empire followed that path, and Britain was no exception during the era when the British pound served as the world's leading reserve currency. That is why the real question is no longer who has the power to sanction the United States. A more meaningful question is what happens if the rest of the world no longer depends on America the way it once did. Today, the US dollar is still involved in approximately 88% of global foreign exchange transactions and accounts for nearly 58% of worldwide foreign exchange reserves. The SWIFT network and the international payment infrastructure ensure that much of the world's financial activity still passes through systems connected to the United States. Washington's broad legal jurisdiction can affect virtually any organization that uses the US dollar, whether it is a major French bank or a leading Chinese technology company. Most governments and businesses choose to comply because the cost of confrontation is simply too high. Yet the true foundation of this entire system is not military power, gold reserves, or balance sheet figures. What keeps this financial empire functioning is trust that assets denominated in US dollars will remain secure for decades, that dollar-based contracts will be honored, that the legal system operates fairly and transparently, and that the US government will always fulfill its financial obligations every day. Trillions of dollars move across the global economy not because anyone is forced to use them, but because banks, businesses, and governments around the world share confidence in those principles. That trust is both the source of the dollar's extraordinary strength and its greatest vulnerability. Weapons and financial assets can be rebuilt, but trust takes decades to earn and only a short time to lose. Every time sanctions are applied too aggressively, every time a nation's assets are frozen, and every time Washington engages in another debt ceiling standoff, the most important pillar supporting the US dollar is quietly weakened: trust. If that confidence were ever to fade significantly, there would be no gunfire and no dramatic declarations of confrontation. Instead, the world would gradually and quietly shift toward alternative payment systems. At that point, the United States might still possess the world's most powerful financial tool, but its influence would no longer be what it once was. So the real question is not whether this transformation will happen, but when. Do you believe the US dollar will remain the world's dominant currency for decades to come? Or are we already witnessing the first signs of a new global financial order? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.